On February 18, 2001, Ken Schrader climbed out of a wrecked race car at Daytona International Speedway and ran toward another one. He was not hurt. The driver inside the black number 3 Chevrolet was his closest friend in racing, and Schrader reached that window before anyone else on the track did. For 25 years, he said almost nothing publicly about what he saw in those seconds. He gave interviews. He sat for documentaries. He talked at length about everything except that. Then, in 2026, as NASCAR marked the quarter-century anniversary of that afternoon, Ken Schrader, now 71 years old, finally sat down and talked about it more openly than he ever had before. This is the story of that day, the friendship that came before it, and the 25 years of silence that followed. The 2001 Daytona 500 was NASCAR's season opener and its biggest stage. It was the first race broadcast under a new television deal, the first Cup race of a new season, and the race every driver in the garage circled on the calendar before any other. Dale Earnhardt, 7-time Cup Series champion, team owner, and the sport's most famous competitor, was running third on the final lap, behind 2 cars he owned. Michael Waltrip, in over 460 career starts, had never won a Cup race. Dale Earnhardt Jr., his son, was running second in just his second full season at the Cup level. This looked like it might finally be Waltrip's day, and it was unfolding exactly the way Earnhardt had built his own team to make happen. Earnhardt had spent years building Dale Earnhardt incorporated into a serious operation, and on that afternoon, it looked like all of it was about to pay off at once. A win for Waltrip, a strong finish for his son, and Earnhardt himself, the man who had already won this race once in a career full of near misses at Daytona, running position to add one more top 5 finish to a resume that barely needed it. Behind Earnhardt, a pack of cars was fighting for position that would not change who won the race, but would end up changing everything else. Ken Schrader was among them, running a strong day. He had led 7 laps and spent much of the afternoon in the top 5. According to a front-stretch interview Schrader gave 25 years after the crash, he had grown tired of being boxed in behind the leaders and decided to move to the outside line heading into the final turns. As he explained it, the group had tried the inside line against Earnhardt many times before, and it never worked. They knew it. So on that final lap, Schrader chose to run high instead, waiting for his moment. Coming off turn 2, Earnhardt's car made contact with Sterling Marlin's, and his Chevrolet shot up the banking toward the wall, directly into Schrader's path on the outside line. Both cars hit the concrete barrier at close to full speed, Earnhardt's car nearly head-on. On television, it did not look catastrophic. NASCAR had seen far more violent, rolling wrecks walk away unheard in years past. Cars flipping end over end, drivers climbing out and waving too. The crowd within seconds. By comparison, this looked almost routine. 2 cars sliding into the wall and settling in the infield grass. The broadcast lingered on Waltrip's celebration in victory lane rather than the wreck unfolding behind it. And for a few minutes, most of the racing world watched the wrong thing. Inside race control, though, the read was different almost immediately. Mike Helton, NASCAR's president at the time, later described picking up on something in the tone of the radio chatter from crews arriving at the scene, and in the way Schrader himself was moving around the wreckage, that told him something wasn't right, long before anyone said so out loud. Schrader climbed out his own car, uninjured, and went straight to Earnhardt's. His bright yellow Pontiac had come to rest nose-to-door with the black number 3 in the infield grass. Schrader took down the window net himself, the same net Earnhardt's crew had secured on pit road hours earlier, and looked inside. He did not need a doctor to tell him what he was looking at. He understood the severity of the situation well before medical staff arrived to confirm anything. He did not try to pull Earnhardt from the wreckage. Instead, he turned and waved urgently for the medical crew to hurry. Years later, in an interview with the Times-Union, Schrader was asked directly whether he knew in that moment. His answer was simple. He said he knew. He said he did not want to be the one who had to say it out loud. Earnhardt was pronounced dead a short time later at Halifax Medical Center. The cause listed in the medical examiner's report was a basilar skull fracture, an injury determined to have been fatal instantly. While rescue workers surrounded the number 3 car, the broadcast stayed on Victory Lane, where Waltrip was celebrating the biggest win of his career, and Earnhardt Jr. had finished second. Both men were driving cars owned by the man, now trapped in the wreckage behind them. Schrader did not go to the media pen. He went looking for Waltrip. He found his friends still in the middle of the celebration and pulled them aside, away from the cameras. He didn't say the final word out loud. He told Waltrip only to be ready for it, to prepare for the worst without hearing it confirmed. In Schrader's own account, Waltrip was one of his closest friends in the garage, and he refused to let him be blindsided by what was coming. Waltrip finished his winner's interview with no idea how quickly the day was about to change. NASCAR President Mike Helton delivered the official announcement to the media that evening. "We've lost Dale Earnhardt." Earnhardt's death led front pages of newspapers that had never covered auto racing before, and his photograph appeared on magazine covers within days. For years afterward, Schrader answered questions about the crash by talking around its center. Reporters tried repeatedly to get him to describe what he saw through that window. He routinely steered the conversation back to the racing itself, the stats, the finish, anything but that moment. Nearly 2 decades after the crash, Schrader still had not spoken a public word about exactly what he saw. To understand why that silence lasted so long, it helps to understand what Schrader and Earnhardt actually were to each other, which by most accounts was closer to family than to fellow competitors. Their friendship produced a string of stories that Schrader has told and retold over the years, most recently in interviews tied to NASCAR's 25th anniversary coverage and on the Herm and Amp Schrader podcast with fellow former driver Kenny Wallace. Before Schrader had even finished building a pond on his North Carolina property, Earnhardt rode out to see the site and told him exactly how to do it, where to dig, where to place the dam, and promised to supply the fish once it was full. Schrader got the job done fast. The pond filled in a matter of days. What he called to collect on the promise, the fish did arrive. They arrived cash on delivery. Schrader still brings up the story as proof that even Earnhardt's generosity came with a catch. In another story from that same podcast appearance, Schrader recalled a day working out at Earnhardt's farm when the two decided to grab lunch. Their usual burger spot was too crowded, so Earnhardt asked if Schrader liked seafood. Schrader said yes. Seafood turned out to mean a short walk to the local convenience store for a box of crackers and a tin of sardines. It was, in Schrader's telling, a small window into how country Earnhardt stayed even after he had become one of the wealthiest men in motorsports. At a car show in Detroit, the two men both fell for the same impractical purchase, an amphicar, a novelty vehicle built to drive on roads and float on water. They got as far as the parking lot on the way to the airport before turning back to buy it. Earnhardt put down cash on the spot. Schrader had his own shop wire a cashier's check and send a truck to collect it. The story almost had a sequel. Former NASCAR President Bill France Jr. and a longtime NASCAR official co-owned a second amphicar, and there was loose talk of staging a race between the two vehicles on the lake inside the Daytona infield. It never happened. The friendship extended to their families. When Schrader's then 10-year-old daughter joined the Earnhardts on an extended family trip aboard their yacht, she grew homesick. It was Earnhardt, not her own father, who pulled her onto his lap and talked her through it until she settled down. Schrader has said she never forgot it. These are small stories. That is, in a sense, the point. They're the kind of details that survive only between people who genuinely liked each other, long after the trophies and the point standings stopped matching. For much of the last 25 years, one explanation for Earnhardt's final laps hardened into something close to accepted fact. That Earnhardt was running defense, holding back the field so his son and his lead driver could cruise to a 1-2 finish unbothered. It's a tidy story. It fits the sentimental narrative many wanted to tell about his death. Schrader's own account of the final lap tells a simpler story, one about hard racing, not sacrifice. In his recollection, the group behind Earnhardt had tried getting underneath him on the inside line many times before that lap, and it had never worked. So when the final restart came, Schrader made the call to go up top instead, positioning himself on the outside and waiting to see whether the cars below him could find a way through. It wasn't a gamble born out of desperation. It was a lesson learned from years of racing against the same driver, a lesson that, on this particular lap, put Schrader closest to the wall when everything went wrong. That detail matters because it reframes the final laps away from a story of noble sacrifice and towards something more familiar to anyone who watched Earnhardt race for 2 decades. A man competing exactly the way he always had, right up until the last corner he ever drove. The weeks that followed turned into one of the most intense periods of change in American racing history. Investigators examined the construction of the concrete wall, the design of the car, and Earnhardt's safety equipment. Earnhardt had reportedly resisted newer head and neck restraint devices, a stance shared by a number of drivers in that era who often treated in-car discomfort as an acceptable trade for feel and control behind the wheel. It was a common attitude at the time. Drivers of Earnhardt's generation had come up believing that stiffness and restriction behind the wheel cost you feel for the car, and feel for the car was what separated the good drivers from the great ones. Earnhardt, more than almost anyone, had built his entire reputation on feel, on being able to sense what a car was about to do a half second before it did it. NASCAR's subsequent investigation examined the physics of the crash in exhaustive detail. The angle of impact, the construction of the wall, the way the seatbelt had failed, the design of the car itself, and led directly to a wave of safety reforms across the sport within a few years. Energy-absorbing safer barriers installed at major tracks. A redesigned car of tomorrow chassis built with driver survivability as a core design goal and mandatory head and neck restraint devices for every driver, no exceptions, no personal preference involved anymore. It is not an exaggeration to say that every driver who has walked away from a hard crash at a NASCAR track in years since owes some part of that to what happened on February 18, 2001. Schrader kept racing through all of it, through the introduction of the very safety systems his own crash helped force into existence, carrying a memory that none of his rivals shared with him, strapping into a car every weekend that was safer because of the day he lost his best friend. In 2026, as the sport marked the 25th anniversary of Earnhardt's death, NASCAR Studios and Fox Sports aired a new documentary, We've Lost Dale Earnhardt, 25 years later, built around rare footage and first-person accounts from that day, including from Mike Helton, the man who had delivered the original announcement to the press in 2001. Around that same anniversary, Schrader gave one of the most extensive interviews of his life to NASCAR.com and a front stretch, revisiting his career, the crash, and the friendship in more detail than he had offered in a quarter century. He walked reporters through where he was in his career at the time, through the crash itself, and through how the years afterward had shaped him. Even then, he stopped short of describing in graphic terms exactly what he saw through that window. What he offered instead was everything around it. The decision to warn Waltrip before anyone else could, his own account of the final lap, and the small, specific, unglamorous details of a friendship, a pond, a stubborn fish delivery, a novelty car neither man could resist. Dale Earnhardt Jr., for his part, has spoken publicly and emotionally about what Schrader has carried on his behalf. In a widely shared appearance on the Dale Jr. Download podcast, Earnhardt Jr. read a note he had written to Schrader, calling him the keeper of that delicate information and telling him he was glad it had been Schrader who was there that day, rather than anyone else. That may be the real shape of Schrader's long silence. It was never about protecting a secret so shocking it couldn't be spoken. It was about protecting a friend's family and legacy from having its most painful moment reduced to a single sentence on a highlight reel, and choosing instead to let a friendship, told through its smallest and warmest details, speak for the man. It's worth remembering what Schrader's own career looked like before that day, because it makes the weight of what he carried afterward even clearer. He was not a rookie standing near a legend. He was a proven Cup Series winner in his own right, a driver who had won the Clash and the duels at Daytona, a competitor good enough to run in the top 5 with Earnhardt all afternoon on the sport's biggest stage. He simply never managed to win the Daytona 500 itself, despite years of trying. That 2001 race was his second season with MB2 Motorsports, a team he believed could finally get him over the line. Instead, it became the race people remember him for entirely differently. Schrader kept racing for more than a decade after 2001, moving between Cup, Xfinity, and Truck Series equipment, and eventually settling into the short track and dirt track racing he had always loved, competing well into his 60s on ovals most fans have never heard of. He never stopped being a racer. He just became a racer who was also, quietly, the last person Dale Earnhardt spoke to before the world changed. Dale Earnhardt's legacy still shapes NASCAR today, referenced by drivers who never shared a garage with him and grew up only watching his highlights on old broadcasts. Every safer barrier bolted into a concrete wall, every Hans device clipped onto a driver's shoulders before a race, every redesigned chassis built with survivability in mind traces back in some way to that. Final lap. Drivers competing in this year's Daytona 500 are alive today, in a very literal sense, because of what NASCAR was forced to learn the weeks after Earnhardt's death. But the fullest portrait of who Earnhardt actually was doesn't come from a highlight reel, a magazine cover, or a list of safety reforms. It doesn't come from the 7 championships or the 76 wins. It comes from the one man who stood closest to him at the very end. The one who bought a ridiculous amphibious car with him on a whim in a parking lot. The one who argued with him decades later and still laughing about it, over a fish delivery that showed up cash on delivery. The one who got taken out for a seafood lunch that turned out to be a tin of sardines from a gas station. And the one who spent 25 years quietly deciding how much of that final moment the world actually needed. Protecting a friend's family from having the worst 30 seconds of their lives reduced to a single line on a highlight reel, and choosing instead to let a friendship, told through its smallest and warmest details, speak for the man. At 71 years old, Ken Schrader finally decided the world could have a little more of it. Not all of it, maybe never all of it, but enough to understand what was actually lost that day at Daytona. Not just a champion, but a friend, a father, and a man who once drove out to a half-built pond just to tell his buddy where to dig.